Hello, Midnight Wanderers, and welcome to Netheric Horror. This is where ancient whispers rise beneath a crimson sky, carrying you softly into the world of dreams and shadows. Before tonight's haunting story begins, tell me, what corner of the world are you listening from? Drop it in the comments. And if the silence of the night calls to you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you'll never miss the moon's next dark secret. When I was a child, summer vacation always meant one thing: spending time at my grandmother's house. Every year, as soon as school ended, my cousins and I would pack our bags and head there for weeks at a time. It became a tradition that everyone looked forward to. The adults enjoyed having the family together, and for us kids, it felt like entering a completely different world. My grandmother lived in an old house on the edge of a small town. It wasn't fancy, but it felt enormous to us. The rooms seemed bigger, the hallways longer, and every corner of the property held something interesting to explore. We spent our days running around the yard, climbing trees, inventing games, and staying outside until the sky turned orange in the evening. One of the most memorable parts of the property was the backyard garden. My grandmother loved gardening and spent countless hours taking care of it. There were fruit trees, flower beds, and rows of vegetables that she proudly showed to anyone who visited. During the daytime, the garden was beautiful. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, birds sang from the branches, and everything felt peaceful. At night, however, the garden became a completely different place. The darkness transformed it into a maze of shadows. The trees seemed taller, the spaces between them deeper. Every movement of the wind made the branches sway, creating strange shapes that looked almost human from a distance. As children, we often dared each other to walk through the garden after sunset, but none of us really liked being out there alone. Next to the garden was a small outdoor bathroom. It wasn't connected directly to the house, so anyone who needed to use it at night had to walk outside, cross part of the backyard, and enter the small building near the trees. Normally, we tried to avoid going there after dark. But one particular summer, something happened that I have never forgotten. A few months before that vacation, my grandfather had passed away. His death affected everyone in the family deeply. He had been the kind of person who was always present. Whenever we visited, he would greet us with a smile, tell stories from his younger days, and spend hours sitting outside under the trees. He seemed like a permanent part of the house itself. Even after his funeral, it was difficult to accept that he was gone. Sometimes I would walk into a room and instinctively expect to see him sitting in his usual chair. Other times, I would hear a familiar sound and turn around, almost expecting him to appear. The adults were grieving in their own way, but as a child, I didn't fully understand death. I knew my grandfather was gone, but part of me still expected him to be there. That summer, despite everything that had happened, the family continued the tradition of gathering at my grandmother's house. My cousins and I arrived as usual, and during the day we laughed, played, and tried to enjoy ourselves. Yet there was a noticeable emptiness around the house. My grandfather's chair on the porch remained empty. His gardening tools sat untouched. The familiar sound of his voice was gone. Even though nobody talked about it constantly, everyone felt his absence. One night, after a long day of playing outside, everyone went to bed. My cousins were sleeping in different rooms throughout the house, and the adults had settled in for the night. The house became quiet. The only sounds were the occasional chirping of insects outside and the distant rustling of leaves in the garden. Sometime after midnight, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. The room was dark except for a small amount of moonlight coming through the window. I lay there for a few moments before realizing that I needed to use the bathroom. Immediately, I felt annoyed. That meant I would have to go outside. I considered trying to ignore it and go back to sleep, but eventually I gave up and climbed out of bed. The wooden floor felt cold beneath my feet. Trying not to wake anyone, I quietly made my way through the house and toward the back door. The moment I stepped outside, the night air hit me. Everything looked different than it had during the day. The garden was covered in darkness, with only patches of silver moonlight filtering through the trees. The shadows seemed deeper than usual. I remember feeling slightly nervous, but I told myself there was nothing to be afraid of. After all, I had walked through that yard hundreds of times. I started toward the bathroom. The path was familiar enough that I could navigate it even in the dark. As I walked, I glanced toward the trees, and that was when I saw him. Standing among the trees was my grandfather. At least that was what it looked like. The figure stood completely still, partially illuminated by the moonlight. I immediately recognized the shape, the height, the posture, the way he stood with his shoulders slightly forward. Even from a distance, it looked exactly like him. For a moment, I simply froze. My brain struggled to process what I was seeing. I stared at the figure, convinced that my eyes were playing tricks on me. But the longer I looked, the more certain I became. It looked exactly like my grandfather. My heart began beating faster. I remember blinking several times, hoping the figure would disappear. It didn't. The person remained standing among the trees, completely motionless. Watching, at least. It felt like he was watching. I couldn't clearly see his face because of the darkness, but there was something familiar about his presence, something that instantly reminded me of all the evenings I had spent with him in that very garden. For several seconds, I stood there, unable to move. Fear mixed with confusion. Part of me wanted to run back inside immediately. Another part of me was simply shocked. I knew my grandfather had died. Everyone knew he had died. I had attended the funeral, yet here I was staring at someone who looked exactly like him. The night suddenly felt much colder. The sounds of insects seemed to fade away. Everything around me felt strangely still. I remember trying to convince myself that it was probably a tree or a shadow. Maybe my imagination was filling in the details. Maybe I was still half asleep. Children often misinterpret things in the dark. That explanation seemed logical. But even as I thought those things, I couldn't stop staring. The figure continued standing there, not moving, not speaking, just existing among the trees. A strange feeling settled over me. Oddly enough, despite my fear, I didn't feel threatened. I wasn't getting the sense that whatever I was seeing wanted to harm me. Instead, the feeling was more emotional than frightening. It felt almost familiar, almost comforting, as strange as that sounds. The figure simply stood where my grandfather had spent so much of his time when he was alive. Near the garden he loved, near the trees he had planted years earlier. For a brief moment, I wondered whether somehow he had come back to visit. Children think differently than adults. At that age, the impossible sometimes feels possible. I stood there for what felt like several minutes, though it was probably much less. Then something happened. A light breeze moved through the garden. The branches shifted. The shadows changed. For a split second, my attention was drawn elsewhere. When I looked back, the figure was gone. Completely gone. The space between the trees was empty. There was nobody there. I stared into the darkness, trying to find any sign of movement. Nothing. Just trees. Just shadows. Just moonlight. I suddenly felt a rush of fear. Whatever calmness I had felt disappeared. I quickly hurried to the bathroom, trying not to look back toward the garden. Every sound seemed louder now. Every rustle of leaves made me jump. The entire time, I kept thinking about what I had just seen. After finishing, I practically ran back to the house. The moment I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, I felt relief. The familiar walls of the house made me feel safe again. I climbed back into bed and pulled the blanket over my head. Sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure standing among the trees. I kept replaying the moment over and over in my mind. Had I really seen my grandfather? Had it been a shadow? A dream? My imagination? I didn't know. The next morning, sunlight filled the house, making everything seem normal again. The garden looked beautiful and harmless. The trees that had seemed mysterious during the night now appeared ordinary. For a while, I almost convinced myself that I had imagined the entire thing. During breakfast, I eventually told some of my cousins what I had seen. Most of them laughed. A few said I was probably dreaming. Others suggested that I had mistaken a tree for a person. Their explanations made sense. Yet something still bothered me. I knew what I had seen. Or at least I believed I did. Later that day, I found myself looking toward the spot where the figure had stood. The area was exactly as I remembered. The same trees, the same garden, the same patch of ground. Nothing unusual. And yet, I couldn't shake the memory. Years have passed since that summer. I am no longer the child who wandered nervously through that backyard in the middle of the night. I understand much more about grief, memory, and the way our minds process loss. Perhaps what I saw was simply my imagination. Perhaps my young mind was still struggling to accept my grandfather's death. Perhaps the combination of darkness, moonlight, and emotion created an illusion. Those explanations are entirely possible. But even today, there is a small part of me that isn't completely convinced. The image remains incredibly clear in my memory. The stillness of the garden, the silver moonlight filtering through the trees, and the unmistakable figure that looked exactly like my grandfather standing quietly in the place he loved most. Whether it was a trick of the mind, a dreamlike moment, or something that can never truly be explained, it remains one of the strangest experiences of my childhood. I have forgotten countless memories from those summer vacations. I can't remember every game we played or every conversation we had, but I remember that night perfectly. I remember stepping outside into the darkness. I remember looking toward the garden, and I remember seeing my grandfather standing silently among the trees, even though he had already been gone for months. To this day, whenever I think about my grandmother's house, that is the memory that returns first. Not the games, not the laughter, not even the holidays themselves. Just a quiet summer night, a garden full of shadows, and a figure that looked exactly like someone I thought I would never see again. I've experienced sleep paralysis 3 times in my life, and even years later, nothing else has ever come close to the level of fear it created. I've been in dangerous situations before. I've been scared by real-life events, accidents, and emergencies. But sleep paralysis is different. The fear doesn't feel normal. It feels primal, raw, and overwhelming in a way that's almost impossible to explain to someone who has never gone through it. Whenever I've tried describing it to friends or family, I can tell they don't fully understand. Some people think it's just a bad dream. Others assume it's something similar to a nightmare. But it isn't. At least, it doesn't feel that way when you're trapped inside it. The first time it happened, I had no idea what sleep paralysis was. I went to bed like I normally did and fell asleep without any problems. Sometime during the night, I suddenly became aware of my surroundings. At first, I thought I had simply woken up. My bedroom looked exactly as it always did. The furniture was in the same places. The faint glow from outside filtered through the curtains. Everything appeared completely normal. Then I realized something was wrong. I couldn't move. At first, I tried lifting my arm. Nothing happened. I tried turning my head. Nothing. I tried sitting up. Nothing. Panic immediately began creeping into my mind. I was fully aware that I was awake. I could hear the ceiling fan spinning. I could hear my husband sleeping beside me. I could hear my own breathing. Every detail of the room seemed perfectly real, yet my body refused to respond. The harder I tried to move, the more terrified I became. Then I noticed something standing beside the bed. To this day, I can still remember exactly what it looked like. It was a dark figure, almost completely black, standing near me and staring down at me. At first, my brain tried desperately to make sense of what I was seeing. Maybe it was a shadow. Maybe I wasn't fully awake. Maybe I was imagining things. But the figure looked completely real. It wasn't blurry. It wasn't transparent. It wasn't floating like a ghost from a movie. It looked solid. Present, alive, the creature stood there, silently, watching me. I could feel its presence the same way you can feel another person standing too close behind you. Every instinct in my body screamed that something was terribly wrong. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. I wanted to wake my husband. But I couldn't do any of those things. I was trapped inside my own body. The figure slowly leaned closer. I remember feeling pressure on my chest, not just emotionally or psychologically, actual physical pressure. It felt as though something heavy was pressing down on me, making it harder to move and harder to think. My breathing became faster. I could hear every breath. In, out. Each breath sounded louder than the last. The creature continued staring at me. The fear grew stronger every second. Then, just as suddenly as it began, I regained control of my body. I sat up immediately. The figure vanished. The pressure disappeared. The room was normal again. My husband was still asleep. The fan was still spinning. Everything looked exactly as it should. I spent the rest of the night awake, trying to convince myself it had only been a dream. But deep down, it didn't feel like a dream. It felt like something I had actually lived through. Months later, it happened again. This time was even worse because I knew what was happening. The moment I became aware that I couldn't move, I felt panic explode inside me. I knew what was coming. I knew I was trapped. I knew my mind was about to create something terrifying. Once again, I could see my bedroom clearly. Once again, I could hear every sound around me. And once again, there was something in the room with me. The dark figure had returned. It stood at the foot of the bed, watching, waiting, completely motionless. The creature seemed larger this time, more defined, more real. I desperately tried to force my body to move. Nothing happened. I tried shouting for help. I couldn't make a sound. My mouth wouldn't open. My voice wouldn't work. The terror that comes from realizing you can't even scream is impossible to describe properly. Every human being grows up believing that if something terrible happens, they can at least yell for help. During sleep paralysis, even that option disappears. You become a prisoner inside your own body. The figure began moving toward me, slowly, deliberately. Every second felt endless. I could hear my own breathing becoming louder and more frantic. I tried focusing on waking up. I tried concentrating on moving a finger. Anything, just one movement. Nothing worked. The creature eventually reached the side of the bed. Then, I felt the familiar pressure on my chest again. Heavy, crushing, as though something was physically holding me down. My heart felt like it was pounding out of my chest. I remember thinking that if I could just make a noise, my husband would wake up. If I could just move my hand, I could shake him. But I remained completely frozen. Finally, after what felt like forever, I snapped awake. The creature disappeared instantly. The room returned to normal, but my heart continued racing long afterward. I couldn't sleep for the rest of the night. The third experience was the worst one. Even now, years later, it's the one I remember most clearly. That night started normally. Nothing unusual happened before bed. Nothing suggested that another episode was coming. Sometime during the night, I became conscious again. The moment awareness returned, I knew. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I couldn't sit up. The familiar fear immediately washed over me. I could hear the fan. I could hear my husband breathing. I could hear myself breathing. Everything around me seemed perfectly real. Then I saw it. The dark figure was back. This time, it wasn't simply standing over me. It was at the foot of the bed. And somehow, I felt it pulling me. The sensation was terrifying. It felt as though something was dragging me downward. Not physically in the way someone might pull your arm. It felt deeper than that, as if I was being pulled away from safety itself. The creature remained completely silent. That silence somehow made everything worse. No growling, no speaking, no threats. Just the overwhelming feeling that something evil was present. My breathing became frantic. I remember desperately trying to scream for my husband. I was certain that if I could make even the smallest sound, he would wake up and help me. But my voice refused to work. Inside my head, I was screaming. Outside, nothing came out. The harder I tried, the more terrified I became. Every second stretched into what felt like minutes. I remember focusing entirely on moving. Just move. Move a finger. Move your hand. Move anything. The effort felt enormous, as if I were trying to lift a car with my bare hands. The creature continued pulling. The pressure continued building. The fear reached a level that I've never experienced anywhere else in life. People often ask what the creature looked like. The truth is that the details aren't what stayed with me. What stayed with me was the feeling, the overwhelming certainty that something dangerous was standing in the room, the absolute helplessness, the inability to escape, the inability to call for help, the knowledge that you are awake enough to know what's happening, but powerless to stop it. Eventually, just like the other times, control returned. Suddenly I could move. Suddenly I could sit up. Suddenly the room was empty. The creature was gone. The pressure vanished. Everything was normal again. But the fear didn't disappear immediately. I sat there shaking. My heart raced. My breathing remained fast. The room looked exactly the same as it had moments earlier, yet I felt completely different. Since then, I've learned much more about sleep paralysis. I understand the science behind it. I know that during certain stages of sleep, the body naturally remains immobile while the brain is active. I know that sometimes people wake up before that paralysis ends. I know that hallucinations can occur because part of the brain is still functioning in a dream-like state. Logically, I understand all of that. But knowing the explanation doesn't make the experience any less terrifying. When you're inside it, logic disappears. Your brain isn't calmly analyzing neurological processes. Your brain is convinced that something real is standing over you. The fear feels genuine because, in that moment, it is genuine. That's what makes sleep paralysis so difficult to explain. People hear the explanation and think they understand. But understanding the science and experiencing it are two completely different things. I've had nightmares that felt real while I was dreaming. I've watched horror movies. I've experienced stressful situations in real life. None of those things compare. Sleep paralysis creates a type of fear that feels older than reason itself. A fear rooted somewhere deep in human instinct. Even years later, I can still remember hearing my own desperate breathing while I tried to scream. I can still remember staring at a dark figure that my brain insisted was real. I can still remember the crushing helplessness of being unable to move. Thankfully, each episode eventually ended. They always do. After a minute or two, movement returned, reality snapped back into place, and the creature disappeared. But during those moments, trapped between sleep and wakefulness, it felt completely real. And no fear I have experienced before or since has ever come close to matching it. Where I grew up, stories about witch doctors and spirits were not unusual. They were woven into everyday life and local traditions. People spoke about them the same way others might talk about family history or community events. Some people believed deeply in those things, while others dismissed them completely. But almost everyone had heard stories. When I was in school, there was a girl who was known by some people to be going through what they called a calling to become a witch doctor. At the time, I didn't really understand what that meant. I had heard adults mention it before, but I never paid much attention. To me, it was simply another one of those mysterious things people talked about that seemed far removed from my everyday life. The girl wasn't one of my friends, and she wasn't even in my year. I knew who she was only because I had seen her around school. We had never spoken, and I knew almost nothing about her. One day, something happened that has stayed with me ever since. It was a completely normal school day. Classes were moving along as usual, students were walking through the hallways, and teachers were busy keeping everything organized. There was nothing unusual about the atmosphere. It felt like every other day. At some point, I left my classroom and stepped into the corridor. The hallway wasn't crowded. A few students were moving between classes, and somewhere in the distance I could hear the usual sounds of a busy school. Lockers were closing, people were talking, and teachers were giving instructions. As I looked down the corridor, I noticed a girl standing against the wall. At first, I didn't think much of it. Then I realized it was the girl people often talked about. What immediately caught my attention was the expression on her face. She looked terrified. Not nervous, not upset. Terrified, her back was pressed against the wall as if she wanted to get as far away from something as possible. Her eyes were fixed on something farther down the corridor. I followed her gaze. There was one of the school cleaners sweeping the floor. He was some distance away from us and appeared to be doing his normal job. He slowly pushed a broom across the hallway and occasionally moved a trash bin as he worked. Nothing about his behavior seemed unusual. He looked completely ordinary. For a moment, I assumed the girl was frightened of something else. Then she spoke. Without taking her eyes off the cleaner, she told me that she could see a spirit attached to him. At first, I didn't know how to respond. The statement caught me completely off guard. I looked back toward the cleaner, expecting to see absolutely nothing unusual. Instead, something happened that I still struggled to explain. As I stared in his direction, I began to notice something too. Even now, years later, I find it difficult to describe exactly what I saw. The image wasn't like seeing another physical person standing there. It was more like becoming suddenly aware of something that seemed impossible, yet somehow felt present at the same time. Whatever it was, it appeared connected to the cleaner. And it terrified me. The best way I can describe it is that it looked demonic. Not in the exaggerated way horror movies often portray demons, but in a way that instantly triggered fear. The moment I became aware of it, every instinct in my body reacted. My stomach dropped. The hairs on my arms stood up. A cold feeling rushed through me. I remember feeling frozen in place. The cleaner himself continued sweeping, completely unaware. He moved naturally. He didn't appear disturbed. He didn't seem to notice anything strange. Yet, both the girl and I stood there, staring in shock. I remember glancing at her and seeing the same fear reflected on her face that I felt myself. Whatever we thought we were seeing, we were both reacting to it. That realization somehow made the experience even more frightening. If I had been alone, I probably would have convinced myself that my imagination was playing tricks on me. But there was another person there, another person who appeared to be seeing the same thing. For what felt like a long time, neither of us moved. We simply stared. The corridor around us seemed strangely distant. The normal sounds of the school faded into the background. My entire attention was fixed on the cleaner and whatever appeared to be attached to him. The fear was overwhelming. I wasn't thinking logically. I wasn't trying to analyze the situation. I simply wanted whatever I was seeing to disappear. Then suddenly, a teacher walked into the corridor. She noticed both of us standing there and immediately asked what was going on. The moment she spoke, something changed. It's difficult to explain, but it felt as though a spell had been broken. 1 second, all of my attention was focused on the frightening image near the cleaner. The next second, everything felt normal again. The strange presence was gone. The cleaner looked completely ordinary. The corridor looked exactly as it should have. The sounds of the school returned to normal. It was as if both of us had been abruptly pulled out of another reality and dropped back into everyday life. I remember blinking several times and looking around. Nothing seemed unusual anymore. The cleaner continued his work as if nothing had happened. If anyone had looked at him, they would have seen exactly what they expected to see. A man cleaning a school hallway. The contrast was shocking. Only moments earlier, I had been convinced I was witnessing something terrifying. Now, everything appeared perfectly normal. The teacher looked confused by our reactions. She could clearly see that both of us were frightened, but she had no idea why. Eventually, we tried to explain what had happened. The teacher listened carefully. Afterward, I spoke with her privately because I was still shaken by the experience. I wanted answers. I wanted someone to explain what I had seen. I remember telling her everything exactly as I experienced it. How the girl had been staring at the cleaner. How she said she could see a spirit attached to him. How I had looked and somehow seen something too. How both of us had become terrified. And how everything seemed to disappear the moment she interrupted us. That was when the teacher told me something I hadn't known before. She explained that the girl was believed by some people to be going through a calling to become a witch doctor. Until that moment, I had never understood why people spoke about her differently. The teacher didn't necessarily confirm or deny anything supernatural. She simply explained the background that I hadn't been aware of before. Learning that information only made the experience more confusing. Part of me wanted a simple explanation. Part of me wanted to dismiss everything as imagination. Yet another part of me couldn't forget how real it had felt. What stayed with me most wasn't the appearance of the thing itself. It was the fear, the immediate and overwhelming fear that appeared the moment I became aware of it. The kind of fear that bypasses logic entirely. The kind of fear that makes your body react before your mind has time to think. Years have passed since that day. I've had countless ordinary experiences and a few unusual ones, but nothing has ever resembled that moment in the corridor. I've never seen anything like it again. I've never suddenly become aware of another presence attached to someone. I've never shared a frightening experience with a stranger in quite the same way. The entire event remains isolated in my memory. One strange moment that began on an ordinary school day and ended just as suddenly as it started. As an adult, I've spent a lot of time wondering what actually happened. Maybe there was a psychological explanation. Maybe the girl's fear influenced my perception. Maybe our minds somehow reinforced each other's expectations in that moment. Those explanations are certainly possible. But even now, I can't completely dismiss the memory. The experience felt too vivid, too immediate, too real. I still remember standing in that corridor, looking toward a cleaner who appeared completely unaware of us. I remember the terror on the girl's face. I remember feeling that same terror myself. And I remember how everything vanished the instant the teacher stepped in and asked a simple question. Whatever happened that day, whether it was something supernatural, psychological, or something else entirely, it remains one of the strangest and most unsettling experiences of my life. I've never experienced anything remotely similar since. And to this day, whenever I think about unusual events that I cannot fully explain, my mind always returns to that school corridor, that frightened girl, and the moment we both seemed to see something that shouldn't have been there. I was in 5th grade when this happened, and even now, years later, I can remember every detail of that morning. I've had plenty of strange experiences in my life, but nothing has ever come close to the fear I felt that day. The memory has stayed with me for so long because I wasn't alone. My best friend was there with me the entire time, and we both saw the same things. It happened during the winter, when school was out for a short break. My best friend was spending the night at my parents' house, something we did fairly often back then. We were at that age where every sleepover felt like an adventure. We would stay up way too late, play video games, eat junk food, and try our hardest not to fall asleep. That night, we decided to build a blanket fort in the living room. To us, it wasn't just a pile of blankets and chairs. It was a fortress. We spent nearly an hour arranging furniture, draping blankets over tables, and creating little tunnels and rooms inside. By the time we were finished, we were incredibly proud of it. The living room lights were off except for a lamp in the corner, giving everything a warm glow. We climbed inside our fort with pillows, sleeping bags, snacks, and flashlights, convinced that sleeping there was far better than sleeping in actual beds. As the night went on, we talked about everything kids talk about at that age. School, games, scary movies we weren't supposed to watch, and ghost stories that seemed much scarier after midnight. Eventually, we reached that point where we were both exhausted but didn't want to admit it. That's when I got an idea. Wanting to mess with my friend, I quietly reached over and knocked on one of the nearby pieces of furniture. Knock, knock, knock. My friend immediately looked up. "What was that?" he asked. Trying not to laugh, I whispered, "I think someone's at the door." He looked genuinely nervous for a second before realizing I was messing with him. Then he rolled his eyes. A few minutes later, he decided to get revenge. While I wasn't paying attention, he knocked on something across the room. The sound echoed through the quiet house. This time, it startled me. I jumped, and he burst out laughing. Before long, we were both taking turns trying to scare each other. One minute I'd knock on a table, the next minute he'd tap on a chair. Every sound seemed much louder because the house was completely silent. Eventually, though, the joke got old. Neither of us was really being fooled anymore. After a while, we agreed it was time to stop. We settled into our sleeping bags, laughed about how stupid we were being, and finally tried to get some sleep. The house became quiet again. At some point during the night, both of us drifted off. The next thing I remember is being suddenly awakened. At first, I didn't know why. The room was dimly lit by the early morning light coming through the windows. Dawn was just beginning. Then, I heard it. Knock, knock, knock. The sound was loud enough to pull me fully awake. Still half asleep, I immediately assumed my friend was trying to continue our prank from the night before. Without even opening my eyes completely, I mumbled something like, "Knock it off." A moment later, another series of knocks echoed through the house. This time, they sounded louder, more deliberate. My friend sat up. I remember him looking at me with an annoyed expression. "Seriously?" he said. "What?" I replied. "I thought that was you." The moment he said that, I felt a small chill run through me, because I had assumed the exact same thing about him. Neither of us had moved. Neither of us had been making the sounds. Then it happened again. Knock, knock, knock. The noise seemed to come from somewhere outside the fort. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. We just listened. The knocking continued. Slow, heavy, deliberate. And then we realized something. It wasn't coming from inside the house. It was coming from the front door. That realization immediately changed the mood. The playful atmosphere from the night before vanished. Now we were simply confused. Who would be knocking at the door that early in the morning? The sun wasn't even fully up yet. The knocking continued. Each series seemed louder than the last. It wasn't frantic. It wasn't the kind of knocking someone does when they're in an emergency. It was steady, patient, as if whoever was outside expected us to answer. My friend and I exchanged nervous looks. Finally, curiosity got the better of us. We climbed out of the blanket fort and slowly walked toward the front of the house. The knocking stopped. That somehow made things even worse. The silence felt strange. We approached the front door carefully. Neither of us really wanted to be the one to open it. Eventually, after arguing about it for a few seconds, we opened the door together. Nobody was there. The front porch was empty. The yard was empty. The road was empty. At first, we just stood there staring. Then we looked down. That's when we noticed the footprints. They were unlike any footprints I had ever seen before. They were enormous, far larger than a normal person's feet. The best way I can describe them is that they looked like footprints left by clown shoes. Each print was unusually long and wide. They were clearly visible in the fresh snow. The sight immediately made both of us uneasy. We stepped outside and examined them more closely. The prints started directly in front of the door. That alone was strange enough. But then we noticed they continued across the yard. Curiosity once again overcame common sense. We decided to follow them. Looking back now, it was probably a terrible idea. At the time, however, we were two kids trying to solve a mystery. The footprints led away from the house. We followed them carefully through the snow. The morning was quiet. The air was cold enough that our breath appeared in front of us. Everything around us was covered in fresh white snow. My parents' property was fairly large. The house sat on about 3 acres of land. Behind it stretched a large open area leading toward a section of woods. From the back of the house to the tree line was roughly 75 yards. The footprints continued across the property. We followed them around the side of the house. Neither of us spoke much. The excitement we initially felt was slowly being replaced by nervousness. The footprints looked wrong. They were too large, too unusual. And we couldn't imagine who would have been walking around our house before sunrise. As we continued following them, the woods grew closer. The tree line looked dark against the snow-covered landscape. Eventually, we reached the edge of the woods. That's where things became even stranger. Near the tree line, we noticed strange marks in the snow. They weren't footprints. They looked more like long lines carved into the surface. The closest comparison I can make is bicycle tire tracks. Thin grooves crisscrossed the snow in random directions. Some curved, some overlapped. Others seemed to stop abruptly. None of it made any sense. There was no bicycle. There was nobody around, just the strange tracks and the oversized footprints leading toward them. At that point, fear finally caught up with us. Whatever excitement we had felt was gone. We were standing near the woods, surrounded by silence, staring at something we couldn't explain. I remember feeling a knot form in my stomach. My friend looked just as frightened as I felt. Neither of us wanted to be there anymore. Without saying much, we both agreed it was time to get back to the house. Fast, we turned around. And that's when the strangest thing happened. Even now, years later, I struggle to explain it. The moment we turned back toward the open yard, everything was gone. Not just the strange tracks. Everything. The footprints. The clown like prints. The bicycle like lines. Even our own footprints. Gone, the snow looked completely untouched. Perfect. Smooth. Pristine. As though nobody had walked on it at all. For several seconds, both of us simply stared. I remember looking back and forth across the ground, trying to understand what I was seeing. The area we had just walked through should have been covered in evidence of our path. Instead, it looked like a fresh blanket of snow. No marks. No disturbances. Nothing. It was as if the entire experience had been erased. I looked at my friend. His expression matched mine exactly. Shock, confusion, fear. Neither of us could find a logical explanation. There was no new snowfall covering the tracks. No wind strong enough to erase them. No reason our own footprints should have vanished. Yet the snow looked untouched from one end of the yard to the other. That was the moment true panic set in. Every instinct told us to get out of there. We ran. Neither of us looked back. We sprinted across the yard toward the house as fast as we could. Our hearts pounded. The cold air burned in our lungs. All we cared about was getting inside. When we finally reached the house and slammed the door behind us, we immediately locked it. Then we stood there breathing heavily, trying to process what had happened. For the rest of the day, neither of us wanted to go back outside. We kept replaying the events over and over. The knocking, the empty porch, the giant footprints, the tracks near the woods, and finally, the impossible disappearance of everything we had seen. As adults, we've occasionally talked about that morning. We've tried to come up with explanations. Maybe we misunderstood something. Maybe there was a natural explanation we failed to recognize. Maybe our memories have changed over time. But no matter how many possibilities we consider, one fact remains. We both remember it. We both remember hearing the knocking. We both remember seeing the footprints. And we both remember turning around to find a perfectly untouched field of snow where moments earlier there had been tracks everywhere. I've experienced frightening situations since then, but nothing has matched the feeling I had standing near those woods that winter morning. To this day, whenever fresh snow covers the ground, I find myself thinking about that strange dawn. The giant footprints, the mysterious knocking, and the moment an entire trail of evidence seemed to vanish without a trace, leaving behind nothing but a flawless blanket of snow and two terrified fifth graders running for their lives. A few years ago, sometime around the fall of 2024, I had an experience that still doesn't make sense to me. I've gone over it countless times in my head, trying to find a logical explanation, but even now, the whole thing feels strange. What makes it even harder to dismiss is that I wasn't alone. 3 of my friends were with me, and all 4 of us remember parts of what happened. It started as a completely ordinary evening. The 4 of us had spent most of the afternoon hanging out and decided to take a walk along a local bike path before heading home. It was something we did fairly often. The path ran through a large wooded area and connected several neighborhoods. During the day, it was usually filled with cyclists, joggers, and families out for walks. That evening, though, it was nearly empty. The sun was already beginning to set, and the sky was turning shades of orange and purple. The temperature had dropped just enough to remind us that summer was over and fall had arrived. Dry leaves covered parts of the path, and every now and then a breeze would send them skittering across the pavement. At first, everything felt normal. We talked about random things, joked around, and took our time walking. Since it was getting dark, we knew we shouldn't stay too long. The bike path was technically part of a park, and the park closed at dusk. Getting caught there after dark usually meant getting lectured by security or park staff. Still, none of us were in a hurry. As the daylight faded, we continued farther down the path. Eventually, we reached a section surrounded by thick trees. The woods on both sides seemed darker than the rest of the area. The branches overhead blocked much of the remaining sunlight, creating long shadows across the pavement. That was when we heard it. At first, it was faint. So faint that I wasn't even sure I'd heard anything at all. Then, it came again. A strange sound drifted through the trees. The best way I can describe it is that it sounded like a woman crying and singing at the same time. It wasn't a normal song. It wasn't a melody any of us recognized. The sound seemed emotional, almost mournful, yet there was something unnatural about it. The strangest part was that it sounded repetitive, almost identical every time we heard it, like the same 5 or 10 seconds of audio playing over and over again. We stopped walking and listened. The sound continued. A short sequence. Then silence. Then the exact same sequence again. Over and over. One of my friends immediately suggested it was probably coming from someone's backyard. There were houses scattered around parts of the trail, and it wasn't impossible that someone was playing music through outdoor speakers. That explanation made sense, at least initially. So we kept walking. But the sound continued. The farther we walked, the more uncomfortable it became. Because it didn't seem to be getting farther away. It didn't seem to be getting closer either. It simply remained there. The same distance away, no matter where we went. The same repeated sound. The same strange combination of singing and crying. At one point, we even stopped talking entirely and just listened. None of us could figure out where it was coming from. If it was a speaker, it should have become quieter as we moved away. If it was a person, there should have been some variation. Instead, it remained exactly the same. The repetition was what bothered me most. It sounded less like a real person and more like a recording stuck on an endless loop. Despite feeling uneasy, we continued walking. None of us wanted to admit how much the sound was getting under our skin. We kept joking about it and pretending it didn't bother us, but I think all 4 of us were becoming increasingly uncomfortable. The woods seemed darker now. The path seemed emptier. Even the ordinary sounds of nature felt absent. No birds, no distant conversations, just that strange repeating noise drifting through the trees. As we continued down the trail, we approached a bridge. The bridge crossed a small creek and connected one section of the path to another. We had crossed it dozens of times before without giving it much thought. We were only a short distance away when something happened. This is where things become difficult for me to explain, because my memory becomes fragmented. One moment, I was walking beside my friends. The next moment, there are gaps, not complete gaps, more like pieces missing from a puzzle. I remember hearing the sound again. I remember looking toward the trees. Then things become blurry. According to my 2 friends who weren't affected, both me and another friend suddenly changed direction. Without saying a word, we apparently started walking toward the tree line. Not casually, not like we were exploring. We simply turned and began moving toward the woods. Our other 2 friends immediately noticed. At first, they assumed we were joking. Then they realized something wasn't right. They called our names. Neither of us responded. They called again. Still nothing. According to them, we acted as though we couldn't hear them at all. That was what frightened them. Normally, if someone calls your name, you instinctively react. You glance over. You answer. You acknowledge them somehow. Apparently, neither of us did any of those things. We just kept moving, step after step, toward the trees, toward the source of that strange sound. The two friends who remained aware began yelling at us. At first, they shouted our nicknames, then our first names. Nothing worked. According to them, it felt as though we were completely disconnected from reality, like we were focused entirely on something they couldn't see. Finally, they started yelling our full names, not shortened versions, not nicknames, our full government names, the names our parents used when we were in serious trouble. The moment they did that, everything changed. I remember hearing my full name suddenly echo through the air. The sound cut through whatever mental fog I was experiencing. It felt almost like waking up. 1 second, my thoughts were distant and unclear. The next second, everything snapped back into focus. I stopped walking, looked around, and realized I was much closer to the woods than I should have been. My friend, who had entered the same strange state, looked equally confused. Both of us seemed to wake up at exactly the same moment. Our other friends were standing farther away, looking terrified. They immediately started yelling at us to get back. I remember feeling a rush of panic, not because I understood what had happened, because I didn't. The confusion itself was frightening. I couldn't explain why I had been walking toward the trees. I couldn't explain why I hadn't heard my friends calling. I couldn't explain why parts of my memory felt missing. Without wasting any time, we hurried back toward them. The moment we regrouped, everyone started talking at once. The two friends who had witnessed everything were clearly shaken. They kept asking what we were doing, why we ignored them, why we kept walking. Neither of us had answers. We genuinely didn't know. At that point, all we wanted to do was leave. The bridge was only a short distance away, so we quickly headed toward it. As we stepped onto the bridge, something happened that immediately sent our fear to another level. The sound followed us, not faded, not distant. Followed, the strange crying and singing noise seemed to move with us. It crossed the bridge, the same repetitive sequence, the same haunting tone, still coming from somewhere nearby. That was the moment when any remaining confidence disappeared. Whatever rational explanations we had been clinging to no longer felt convincing. The idea of a neighbor playing music didn't make sense anymore. The sound should have remained in one location. Instead, it seemed connected to us. At least that's how it felt in that moment. Nobody suggested stopping. Nobody suggested investigating. We were done. Pure fear took over. The four of us broke into a run. The sound seemed to continue behind us as we sprinted down the path. Every glance toward the trees made my stomach tighten. Every shadow suddenly looked threatening. The entire area felt wrong. We didn't slow down until we reached the edge of the neighborhood. Only then did we finally stop to catch our breath. By that point, the sound had disappeared. The silence felt almost shocking after hearing it for so long. For several minutes, none of us knew what to say. We were exhausted, confused, and more than a little scared. Eventually, we all went home, but none of us stopped thinking about what had happened. Over the next few days, we talked about it repeatedly. Everyone compared memories. Everyone tried to piece together the timeline, the strange sound, the repetitive singing, the feeling that had followed us, the missing memories, the unexplained walk toward the trees. The sudden snap back to reality when our names were shouted. The more we discussed it, the stranger it seemed. Even now, I still don't know what happened. Maybe there was a completely ordinary explanation that we failed to recognize. Maybe the atmosphere, darkness, and power of suggestion affected us more than we realized. Maybe there was some environmental sound creating an illusion of movement. Maybe there was a psychological explanation for the trance-like state. All of those possibilities exist, yet none of them fully explain why two people experience the same strange lapse at the same time, or why the sound seems so persistent, or why all four of us walked away feeling like something genuinely unusual had occurred. Years later, whenever that evening comes up in conversation, the story remains exactly the same. The details haven't changed. The confusion hasn't disappeared. And nobody has ever found a satisfying answer. What I remember most isn't even the sound itself. It's the feeling. The feeling of standing on a dark path surrounded by trees, hearing something that shouldn't have been there, and realizing that for a brief moment, I had no idea where my own mind had gone. Out of all the strange experiences I've had in my life, that remains one of the few that still leaves me genuinely unsettled whenever I think about it. A few years ago, I had an experience on my way to work that still makes me uncomfortable whenever I think about it. Looking back, it almost sounds exaggerated because it seems ridiculous that someone would spend that much time following another car over something so minor. But it happened, and at the time it was genuinely one of the most stressful drives of my life. I worked in disability care, which often meant starting very early in the morning. On this particular day, my shift started shortly after sunrise, so I was on the road around 6 in the morning. The streets were mostly empty, and traffic was light. It should have been a quiet, uneventful drive. For the first part of the trip, everything was normal. I was listening to the radio and mentally preparing for the day ahead. One of the things I always tried to do before arriving at work was clear my head. My clients depended on me being calm, patient, and focused, so I preferred peaceful mornings whenever possible. Unfortunately, that wasn't how this morning turned out. As I approached a merging lane, I noticed another car beside me. At first, I didn't think much of it. Merging happens constantly, and most people handle it without any drama. But this driver clearly had other ideas. As the lane began narrowing, it became obvious they wanted to get in front of me. Instead of adjusting their speed and merging normally, they started accelerating. The problem was that the merge lane wasn't very long. They were trying to squeeze ahead at the last possible second. I could see exactly what they were doing. At that moment, I had two options. I could hit the brakes and let them force their way in front, or I could simply maintain my speed. I chose to maintain my speed. Not because I wanted to race them, not because I wanted to block them. I was simply driving normally. There was plenty of room behind me for them to merge safely. In fact, I even gestured to let them know they could move in behind my car. I remember giving a small wave, trying to signal that there was no problem, and that they could merge behind me. The road was nearly empty anyway. There was no reason for either of us to rush. Instead of calming the situation down, that seemed to make them furious. The driver immediately started laying on the horn. The sound echoed through the otherwise quiet morning. I glanced in my mirror and could already tell they were angry. Very angry. They eventually merged behind me, but instead of continuing on their way, they stayed right on my bumper. At first, I assumed they were just venting their frustration. Maybe they'd honk a few times and then move on. That's what most people would do. Instead, their behavior became increasingly aggressive. They started tailgating. Not the occasional close following distance that annoys people. I mean genuinely close. Close enough that I could barely see the front of their vehicle in my rearview mirror. Every time I slowed slightly for a curve or approached a roundabout, they got even closer. Then the swerving started. They would move left, then right, then left again, as though trying to intimidate me. The horn continued too. Short bursts, long blasts, anything they could do to get my attention. At that point, I was annoyed, but not yet scared. I assumed they'd eventually turn off somewhere and disappear. After all, who stays angry over a merge lane for more than a few minutes? Apparently, this person did. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Then 15. And they were still there. Every roundabout made the situation worse. They would speed up aggressively behind me. Tailgate, swerve. Sometimes I thought they were going to hit my car. The entire situation started feeling increasingly surreal. The roads were still relatively empty. There was no traffic jam, no ongoing conflict, no reason whatsoever for them to keep doing this. Yet they refused to leave. That's when the fear started replacing the annoyance. I began wondering where this was heading. I wasn't worried about myself getting into an argument on the side of the road. What worried me was where I was going. Work. My clients didn't deserve to be exposed to something like that. Many of them were vulnerable people who relied on consistency and stability. The last thing I wanted was some enraged stranger showing up and creating a scene. The more I thought about that possibility, the more anxious I became. I started checking my mirrors constantly. Every time I looked, the car was still there. Every time. At some point, the whole situation became so absurd that I actually questioned my own perception. I was tired. It was early. I worked long hours. For a brief moment, I wondered whether I was becoming paranoid. Was this really the same car? Maybe multiple vehicles just happened to look similar. Maybe I was imagining the connection. Maybe I was overreacting. So I started paying closer attention. I checked the shape of the vehicle, the color, the headlights, the position. It was absolutely the same car. There was no doubt. And that realization somehow made everything worse. Because it meant this wasn't in my head. This person was intentionally staying behind me. At that point, I was getting close to work. I needed to know for certain whether they were following me. So I decided to test it. Instead of continuing directly to my workplace, I started taking random turns. Left, then right, then left again, then another right. The route stopped making sense. Anyone simply traveling in the same direction would have continued on their way. This driver didn't. Every turn I made, they made too. Without hesitation, without delay. Still close behind, still driving aggressively, still clearly focused on me. That's when I became convinced. They weren't coincidentally behind me. They were following me. A knot formed in my stomach. I remember gripping the steering wheel tighter. The entire drive suddenly felt much more serious. This wasn't road rage that lasted a minute or two. This person had now spent nearly 20 minutes chasing me. 20 minutes. All because I hadn't slammed on my brakes and rewarded their dangerous behavior. The closer I got to work, the more determined I became not to let them follow me there. I didn't know what their intentions were. Maybe they just wanted to scare me. Maybe they wanted a confrontation. Maybe they planned to yell. Maybe worse, I wasn't interested in finding out. Then I spotted an opportunity. There was a road nearby that ended in a dead end. Most people avoided it because it served very little purpose. I knew the area well enough to remember something important. The road had a sharp turn before the actual dead end. An idea immediately formed. I turned onto the road. Predictably, the car followed. I accelerated slightly. They accelerated too. The gap between us remained the same. For the first time during the entire drive, I felt confident that I might actually lose them. The road stretched ahead. The dead end approached. I could practically feel their determination behind me. They clearly expected me to continue straight. At the last possible second, I took the turn. Not recklessly, not dangerously, just quickly enough to make it difficult for someone following too closely to react. The driver behind me wasn't prepared. Because they had been so focused on staying directly behind my car, They reacted too late. I saw them hit the brakes. The front of their vehicle dipped. They missed the turn. By the time they corrected, I was already gone. I continued for another block before making another turn. Then another. My heart was pounding. I checked every mirror repeatedly. Nothing. No car. No headlights. No sign of them. For the first time in nearly 20 minutes, I felt myself relax. I kept driving a little farther just to be sure. Then I carefully looped back around. The road where I'd lost them was completely empty. The vehicle had vanished. Whether they finally gave up, got lost, or simply couldn't find me again, I never found out. And honestly, I didn't care. I was just relieved. I eventually made my way to work without incident. Nobody followed me into the parking lot. Nobody confronted me. Nobody showed up looking for a fight. The rest of the day passed normally. But the experience stayed with me. Even now, when I think about it, what stands out most isn't the aggressive merge. People drive badly all the time. It's the commitment. The fact that someone was so angry over such a minor event that they spent nearly 20 minutes following another vehicle. The fact that they continued through countless turns. The fact that they seemed completely determined not to let it go. At the time, it was genuinely frightening. There were moments when I questioned whether I was imagining it. Moments when I hoped there was some innocent explanation. But after the random turns, after the dead-end road, and after watching them follow every move I made, there was no doubt left in my mind. They were following me. And to this day, I'm grateful I managed to lose them before they discovered where I worked. Because whatever they hoped to accomplish that morning, I certainly didn't want it happening in front of the people I cared for every day. For several years, I managed a bar that occupied the ground floor of a very old building. Like many older buildings, it came with a long history and more than a few stories attached to it. Most of them were probably exaggerated over time, but there was one detail about the building that everyone knew for a fact. Above the bar was an apartment. Long before I ever worked there, that apartment had operated as a brothel. It had been shut down sometime in the 1960s, decades before I was born. By the time I started managing the bar, the place had gone through countless renovations, ownership changes, and different businesses, but the history was still part of the building's identity. The older regulars loved talking about it. The retired staff members had stories. Even former owners occasionally mentioned strange things that had happened over the years. I never paid much attention to any of it. Like most people, I figured old buildings make noises. Floors settle, pipes creak, doors shift. If you spend enough time in a place, you'll eventually convince yourself that every unusual sound means something. At least, that's what I believed. The bar itself had two entrances. There was the main front door where customers entered during business hours, and there was a back entrance used by staff and deliveries. At the end of every night, after the last customer left and the doors were locked, I would stay behind to handle closing duties. It became a routine. I'd count my cash drawer, finish payroll, complete paperwork, double-check inventory. Then I'd lock everything up and head home. I always sat in the same spot. From that chair, I faced the front entrance, while the back door remained behind me. It wasn't a conscious security decision at first. It was simply the most convenient place to work. Over time, though, I began noticing something strange. While sitting there alone after closing, I would often hear what sounded like someone entering through the back door. The sound was unmistakable. The handle moving, the slight creak of the door, the familiar noises I'd heard hundreds of times during normal business hours. Every single time, my reaction was the same. I'd spin around expecting to see an employee who forgot something, or maybe someone trying to get inside after closing. Every single time, there was nothing there. The back door remained closed. The room was empty. At first I ignored it. Old building, old sounds, simple explanation. But it kept happening. Weeks turned into months. The noises continued. Not every night, but often enough that I began anticipating them. Sometimes I would hear what sounded like footsteps. Other times it was just the sound of the door. Every time I checked, there was nothing. I never felt particularly frightened. Mostly I was annoyed. Closing took long enough without constantly stopping to investigate noises. Still, I couldn't deny that something felt strange about those moments. The sounds always seemed deliberate, almost as if someone wanted me to turn around. Then came the night that changed everything. It was a normal closing shift. The customers had gone home. The chairs were up, the lights were partially dimmed, the doors were locked. I was sitting at my usual spot, counting down my drawer and working on payroll. Everything seemed completely ordinary. Then, without warning, a feeling came over me. To this day, it's difficult to describe. It wasn't fear exactly. It was more like an overwhelming sense that I shouldn't be there. A deep, instinctive feeling that I was being watched. The sensation was so sudden and so strong that I actually stopped what I was doing. I remember looking around the empty bar. Nothing seemed unusual, yet the feeling remained. The atmosphere felt heavy, uncomfortable, almost oppressive. It was as though someone was standing behind me silently, observing everything I did. I tried shaking it off. I told myself I was tired. Managing a bar meant long hours and late nights. Maybe I was simply exhausted. Then I heard it. The back door. The exact same sound I'd heard countless times before. The handle moving. The door opening. The familiar noise of someone entering. The difference was that this time, every hair on my arms immediately stood up. I knew that door was locked. I had personally checked it. Nobody should have been coming inside. Slowly, I turned around. And there he was, standing in the doorway. A man. A very tall man. He was leaning casually against the doorframe as though he belonged there. The thing I remember most clearly was how completely real he looked. Not transparent, not shadowy, not ghost-like. Just a person, an actual person. He wore a suit that looked old-fashioned, but well-kept. His posture was relaxed. His expression was not. He looked irritated, almost angry. The kind of expression a strict boss might wear after catching an employee doing something they shouldn't. Oddly enough, my first reaction wasn't terror. My first thought was practical. I assumed I had somehow forgotten to lock the back door. The situation seemed obvious. Someone had entered. I was alone. And unfortunately, I was sitting between him and the nearest exit. My mind immediately shifted into customer service mode. Trying to stay calm, I spoke to him. "I'm sorry, we're closed. I can't have anyone in here right now." The words came out automatically, the way they would have with any customer who wandered in after hours. The man didn't respond. He simply stared. I remember feeling increasingly uncomfortable under that stare. Not threatened exactly. Judged as though he disapproved of something. For a brief moment, I glanced toward my phone. It was only a quick look, a split second. I wanted to make sure it was nearby in case I needed help. Then I looked back. The doorway was empty, completely empty. The man was gone. No footsteps, no sound, nothing, just gone. At first, my brain refused to process what had happened. I sat frozen, staring at the doorway, trying desperately to come up with a rational explanation. Maybe he stepped away. Maybe he moved faster than I realized. Maybe I imagined him. But none of those explanations felt convincing. The thing that frightened me most wasn't seeing him. It was how real he had looked. Every detail had seemed solid and physical. The suit, the height, the facial expression. Everything. I remember realizing my hands were shaking. Not slightly. Violently, I could barely hold the paperwork in front of me. Even then, part of me still refused to believe what I had experienced. Once I managed to calm down enough to think clearly, I decided to check the security cameras. Surely the cameras would show something. Even if it wasn't exactly what I saw, there would be evidence that someone had entered. I pulled up the footage and watched. The video showed me sitting alone, then suddenly turning around, then speaking toward the doorway, then staring. To anyone else watching the footage, it looked as though I was talking to empty space. There was no visible man, no figure, nothing obvious. The only strange detail was a slight distortion, a tiny patch of fuzziness near the doorway, so subtle that I probably wouldn't have noticed it if I hadn't known exactly where to look. That was it. No evidence, no proof, just me talking to nothing. Needless to say, nobody believed me. Honestly, I didn't fully believe myself. Not at first. I spent months trying to convince myself I had been tired, overworked, stressed, anything that could explain what happened. Then something occurred that completely changed my perspective. A retired owner of the bar posted an old photograph online. They had been sorting through boxes of historical items related to the building and decided to share some images from the late 1950s. The photograph featured the exterior of the bar back when the upstairs apartment was still operating as a brothel. Several people were standing outside, employees, workers, customers, and among them was the brothel manager. The moment I saw the picture, my stomach dropped. I knew that face. Immediately, there was no hesitation, no uncertainty. It was him, the same man I had seen standing in the doorway, the same height, the same posture, the same suit style. Most disturbing of all, the exact same expression. That annoyed, disapproving look. The realization genuinely shook me. Up until that point, I had always assumed there must be some logical explanation. Seeing that photograph made that explanation much harder to maintain. I hadn't seen the picture before. I didn't know what the manager looked like. Yet the resemblance was exact. After that, I found myself thinking about him often. The more I learned about the building's history, the more curious I became. According to old stories, the brothel manager had been extremely strict. Everything revolved around business. Everything revolved around money. He reportedly expected people to work constantly and kept a close eye on operations. Whether those stories were true or not, I couldn't stop thinking about the expression on his face the night I saw him. He had looked annoyed that I was sitting down, annoyed that I wasn't actively working. Eventually, mostly as a joke, I started talking to him during closing. Whenever I sat down to do paperwork, I would announce what I was doing. I'd tell him the cleaning was finished. I'd mention that the cash drawers were balanced. I'd explain that everything had been taken care of. It sounds ridiculous, and I fully admit that. But something interesting happened. The strange noises became less frequent. The sounds at the back door slowed down. The unsettling feeling of being watched became less common. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe my imagination had finally settled down. Or maybe, in some strange way, we'd reached an understanding. Even now, I don't claim to know what happened. Maybe I experienced a vivid hallucination. Maybe there was a psychological explanation. Maybe the photograph simply reinforced a memory that wasn't entirely accurate. All of those possibilities exist. But I still remember that night perfectly. I remember hearing the door. I remember turning around. And I remember seeing a tall man in a suit leaning against the doorway, staring at me. with the expression of someone who expected work to be done. Whether he was real, imagined, or something in between, he remains one of the strangest experiences of my life. And if by some chance he's still keeping an eye on that old building, I hope he's satisfied that everything got cleaned, counted, and locked up properly before I went home. When I was around 8 or 9 years old, my family moved from Michigan to a small town in North Carolina called Granite Falls. At the time, I was excited about the move because I was still young enough to think every new place was an adventure. Looking back now, I wish we had never lived there. Even before the strange experiences started, there was something unsettling about that neighborhood. The house sat in a cul-de-sac, and from the moment we arrived, it felt like we weren't welcome. We later learned that the previous occupants had been evicted, and many of the people living nearby were friends or relatives of that family. For whatever reason, they immediately disliked us. Maybe it was because we moved into the house. Maybe it was because we were outsiders from Michigan. Whatever the reason, they made their feelings known. They tore through our yard on four-wheelers, destroying parts of the property. They regularly harassed us. On more than one occasion, people would walk past the house carrying guns and make it very clear they wanted us gone. As a kid, I didn't fully understand how serious that was. I only knew that the adults in my family were constantly stressed. The neighborhood dogs didn't help either. Dogs bark at things all the time, but the dogs around our house seemed obsessed with it. Day or night, there was always barking. Sometimes it would happen in the middle of the night for no obvious reason. Sometimes multiple dogs would start at once. It became so common that we eventually stopped commenting on it. Because of the aggressive neighbors and the constant barking, my sister developed a strange sleep schedule. She was 12 years older than me and became unofficial security for the house. She would stay awake most of the night listening for trouble and sleep during the day whenever she could. At the time, I thought she was just being protective. Years later, I learned she had other reasons for staying awake. There were things happening inside the house, too. A lot of those details were hidden from me while we lived there. My father and sister didn't want to scare me, and my mother already had enough stress to deal with. Only after we moved away did I start hearing the full stories. My dad eventually told me that one morning while getting ready for church, he heard what sounded like chanting coming from the woods behind our property. Not talking, not people laughing. Chanting, it was early in the morning, and the sound carried through the trees. At the time, he assumed it might have been some of the local troublemakers. Given the behavior of our neighbors, that explanation almost seemed reasonable. Still, nobody ever found evidence of people gathering back there. My sister had her own experiences. She claimed she would occasionally hear what sounded like a child laughing and running through the house. The problem was that I was the only child living there. And according to her, the sounds never matched anything I did. The footsteps would move through rooms where nobody was. The laughter would appear out of nowhere and then stop. She never knew where it was coming from. My first personal experience happened in the dining room. I was playing with a dollhouse that had a small sandbox on the roof. I was completely focused on what I was doing when I suddenly got the feeling that someone was watching me. Most people have experienced that feeling at some point. That strange awareness that makes you stop and look around. At first, I glanced toward a Homer Simpson radio my dad owned. It had large eyes that doubled as tuning dials. For some reason, it looked like it was staring directly at me. The sight made me uncomfortable, so I turned it around and went back to playing. The feeling didn't go away. If anything, it became stronger. This time I looked toward the living room. The room had several bay windows, and sunlight was pouring through them. That's when I saw it. In the farthest window was the silhouette of a head. Just a head. No body. No clear features. Just the shape of a human head. I remember freezing immediately. My mother and sister weren't home. They had gone out to get pizza. The only other person in the house was my dad. I ran and told him what I had seen. He checked the area immediately. Nothing. The figure was gone. To this day, I honestly can't remember whether it appeared to be inside the house or outside the window. What I do remember is that it was there. I saw it, and it terrified me. Still, that experience was nothing compared to what happened later. The second experience remains one of the most traumatic moments of my life. Even now, as an adult, it can trigger anxiety if something reminds me of it. The event happened on the day we were moving back to Michigan. I woke up and immediately noticed the house felt different. Quiet, very quiet. The power had been disconnected. I found my sister and asked what happened. She explained that our parents had gone out to finalize some paperwork involving utilities and the move. She was tired and wanted to keep sleeping. I left her room and went into my parents' bedroom. Since there was nothing else to do, I grabbed my Nintendo Ds and climbed onto their bed. I remember exactly what game I was playing. Cartoon Network Racing. I was driving around Dexter's laboratory when that familiar feeling returned. The feeling that someone was watching me. It hit so suddenly that I paused the game. Then I looked up and saw it, standing in the doorway. To this day, I have never seen anything that frightened me more. The figure was enormous, at least 7 feet tall, maybe taller. It filled the doorway almost completely. Its body looked human in shape, but it wasn't human. The entire thing appeared black. Not black clothing, not a dark silhouette. The figure itself seemed made from darkness, yet somehow I could still see details. The lighting in the room created highlights and shadows across its form. It was as though darkness itself had taken shape, and it was staring directly at me. What I noticed next made everything worse. Part of its face appeared destroyed. The left side looked as though it had been blown apart. Pieces of flesh seemed to hang loosely from exposed bone. The image was horrific and completely impossible. The sunlight streaming through the house should have blocked my view if it were a solid object. Instead, the sunbeams coming through the skylight passed right through it. I remember realizing that and feeling my stomach drop. This wasn't a person. This wasn't an intruder. I had no explanation for what I was looking at. For what felt like forever, neither of us moved. I don't think I was even breathing. People often use the phrase frozen in fear. That moment taught me exactly what that phrase means. I wasn't physically trapped. I wasn't unable to move. I was simply so terrified that every instinct in my body shut down. The thing continued staring at me, then slowly turned its head away. Without making a sound, it walked past the doorway and disappeared to the right. I remained exactly where I was, still staring, still terrified, still struggling to breathe. Eventually, I forced myself to move. I climbed off the bed and walked toward the doorway. I remember silently begging that it wouldn't still be there. When I looked around the corner, the hallway was empty. The figure was gone. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt panic. I hurried into the dining room where our rabbit lived. Her name was K.T. Else, which was supposed to be Cuddles. I had named her when I was 5 and didn't know how to spell properly. The moment I looked at her, I knew something was wrong. She was pressed into the far corner of her hutch, shaking, breathing rapidly. Terrified, seeing her reaction affected me almost as much as seeing the figure. Animals don't understand ghost stories. Animals don't create elaborate explanations. Yet she looked exactly how I felt. Once I made sure she was okay, I ran to my sister's room. I was crying by then, completely overwhelmed. I woke her up and told her everything. She listened quietly, and then told me to bring my Ds into her room. She let me sit at the foot of her bed until our parents returned. Even now, I appreciate that more than she probably realizes. The final strange event happened later that same day while we were loading the moving truck. Most of the house was packed by then. My sister and I were carrying boxes while our parents moved things outside. At one point, both of them were gone. It was just the two of us inside. That's when we heard it. A voice, a male voice, loud enough to hear clearly. It sounded like someone calling out, almost like a drawn-out hello. The problem was that we knew nobody else was inside. The house was practically empty. The sound echoed through the rooms. We both stopped immediately. We both heard it. When we told our father, he searched the entire property. Inside, outside, every room. Nothing. No person. No explanation. That was the last experience before we finally left. Years later, every member of my family still agrees that something was wrong with that house. Maybe it was the hostile neighbors. Maybe it was the atmosphere. Maybe it was something else entirely. We eventually learned the house had been struck by lightning multiple times over the years, which only added to the strange reputation surrounding it. Obviously, lightning doesn't create ghosts. But when combined with everything else, it only made the place seem more cursed. The worst part is that the experiences didn't completely leave me behind. Several years later, while living somewhere else entirely, I thought I saw something that resembled the shadow figure from the doorway. The resemblance alone triggered a severe panic attack. My reaction was so intense that my sister came to pick me up after my parents got home because I couldn't stand being alone. That's why I get frustrated when people assume stories like this are made up. I've had people tell me it's a great horror story. Others have accused me of being a convincing liar. The truth is much less entertaining. I don't know what I saw. I don't know what happened in that house. But I do know that the memories followed me into adulthood. They caused nightmares. They caused panic attacks. And more than 20 years later, I can still close my eyes and see that 7-foot figure standing silently in the doorway, watching me. That's not a story I enjoy remembering. It's a memory I've spent most of my life trying to forget. I've had plenty of strange experiences in my life, but very few of them have stayed with me the way this one has. Nothing dramatic actually happened. Nobody got hurt. There was no chase, no attack, no shocking ending. In fact, if I tried to explain it to someone who wasn't there, it would probably sound completely ordinary. It was just a dog. At least, that's what it looked like. And yet, more than a decade later, I still get chills when I think about it. I was around 13 years old at the time. It was a normal day in my neighborhood. Nothing unusual had happened beforehand. I wasn't watching a scary movie, reading ghost stories, or thinking about anything creepy. As far as I can remember, I was simply going about my day the same way I always did. At some point, I stepped outside my house. The moment I did, I noticed something across the street. A dog was sitting on a front porch. Normally, that wouldn't have caught my attention. Plenty of people in the neighborhood had dogs. But this dog was different. It was a husky. Even now, years later, I can picture it perfectly. The animal was absolutely striking. Its coat stood out immediately. But what caught my attention most were its eyes. They were an intense blue, not ordinary blue, the kind of bright, icy blue that almost seems unreal. The moment I noticed the dog, it was already looking directly at me, not glancing in my direction, not casually watching the street, staring, completely focused on me. The gaze was so intense that I immediately stopped walking. For a few seconds, I simply stood there looking back at it. The dog never moved. That was the first thing that felt strange. Most dogs react somehow when they notice a person. They wag their tails, shift positions, look around, show curiosity. This dog did none of those things. It sat perfectly still, its eyes locked onto mine, and it never looked away. At first, I was simply curious. I had lived in that neighborhood for a while, and I couldn't remember ever seeing this dog before. That was unusual. A husky isn't exactly easy to overlook. They're large, beautiful animals that tend to attract attention wherever they go. If this dog belonged to someone nearby, I felt like I would have noticed it before, yet I had absolutely no memory of seeing it. I looked around for an owner. Nobody was outside. The street was quiet. The porch appeared empty except for the dog. The entire scene felt oddly still. Then something happened that I still struggle to explain. A feeling came over me. Not fear exactly, at least not at first. It was more like a sudden wave of dread. The sensation appeared almost instantly. One second I was looking at a dog. The next second I felt as though something was terribly wrong. The pit of my stomach dropped. My chest tightened. Every instinct I had suddenly started screaming at me. I remember feeling an overwhelming certainty that I needed to get away. Immediately, there was no obvious reason for this reaction. The dog wasn't growling. It wasn't barking. It wasn't acting aggressively. It was just sitting there, looking at me. Yet the feeling kept growing stronger. The longer I looked into its eyes, the worse it became. The dread transformed into something much deeper, something harder to describe. The best way I've ever been able to explain it is that I felt like I wasn't looking at an ordinary dog anymore. I know how ridiculous that sounds. Trust me, I do. Even as I think about it now, part of me recognizes how irrational it seems. But that's honestly how it felt. My 13-year-old brain became convinced that there was something wrong with what I was seeing. Not wrong with the dog physically, wrong in a deeper way. I remember having the bizarre thought that whatever was looking back at me wasn't really a dog at all. It felt as though something else was hiding behind those eyes. Something intelligent, something hostile, something ancient. The closest description I can give is that I felt like I was staring at something evil wearing the shape of a dog. At the time, the word that immediately entered my mind was demonic. Not because of anything the dog did, because of the feeling it created, the overwhelming sense of doom, the certainty that I needed to leave. I've never experienced anything quite like it before or since. The dog continued staring, completely motionless. The blue eyes never seemed to blink, never seemed to shift. They remained fixed directly on me. I don't know how long we stood there looking at each other. Probably only a few seconds. Maybe 10, maybe 15. Fear has a way of stretching time. What felt like a minute may have been much less. Eventually, instinct won. I turned around and ran, not walked. I sprinted back into the house as fast as I could. I slammed the door behind me and immediately moved away from the windows. My heart was pounding. I remember feeling foolish and terrified at the same time. Part of me knew I had just run from a dog that wasn't even moving. Another part of me felt absolutely certain that I had done the right thing. For several moments, I stayed inside trying to calm down. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me. I approached a window and carefully looked outside. The porch was empty. The dog was gone. At first, I assumed it had simply wandered away, but something about that bothered me. I hadn't been inside very long. Only a short amount of time had passed. The dog had vanished almost immediately. I looked up and down the street. Nothing. No husky. No owner. No movement. Just an ordinary neighborhood. The entire scene appeared completely normal. It was as though the animal had never been there at all. Over the following days, I kept expecting to see it again. If it belonged to someone nearby, surely it would reappear eventually. I watched for it. I paid attention whenever I walked outside. But it never returned. Not once. I never saw that dog again. Not in the neighborhood. Not on another street. Nowhere. As the years passed, I tried to come up with explanations. Maybe the dog belonged to a visitor. Maybe someone was passing through the area. Maybe I simply happened to encounter it on the one day it was there. Those explanations make sense. The strange part isn't really the dog itself. It's the feeling. That intense, overwhelming feeling of dread. I've spent years trying to understand where it came from. Maybe there was something about the dog's behavior that triggered an instinctive response. Animals communicate through body language in ways we don't always consciously recognize. Perhaps I picked up on something unusual without realizing it. Perhaps my brain noticed details that my conscious mind couldn't identify. That's certainly possible. In fact, it's probably the most logical explanation, but even if that's true, it doesn't fully capture how powerful the experience felt. The fear wasn't mild. It wasn't nervousness. It felt primal. The kind of warning that bypasses logic entirely. The kind that simply tells you to leave. Immediately, what makes the memory so persistent is that nothing else happened. There was no conclusion, no explanation, no reveal. Just a strange dog staring across a quiet street, and a 13-year-old kid suddenly convinced he was standing in the presence of something deeply wrong. Maybe it was an ordinary husky. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe my imagination filled in the blanks. I honestly don't know. All I know is that whenever I think about that moment, I can still picture those bright blue eyes staring directly into mine. I can still feel that sudden drop in my stomach. And I can still remember the overwhelming urge to run. More than anything, I remember the certainty. The absolute certainty that whatever was sitting across the street wasn't something I wanted to get any closer to. Whether that feeling came from instinct, imagination, or something I'll never understand, it remains one of the most unsettling moments of my entire life. And even now, after all these years, the memory is enough to send a chill down my spine. Some places seem to carry a certain atmosphere with them. You can walk into them and immediately feel that something is different, even if you can't explain why. Whether it's history, isolation, architecture, or simply your imagination responding to the environment, some places leave a lasting impression before anything unusual even happens. My Nana's house was one of those places. The house itself was old. Not just old in the sense that it had been around for a few decades. It had been in the family for generations. According to family history, it was originally built by my great-great-great-grandfather. The structure had stood there for an incredibly long time, surviving changing times, changing generations, and countless family stories. It sat in a tiny ghost town that felt frozen in time. Whenever people hear the term ghost town, they often picture abandoned buildings and tumbleweeds rolling through empty streets. This wasn't exactly like that. People still lived there, but barely. The population was tiny, and the entire place seemed to exist in a strange state between past and present. Every time I visited, I noticed the same feeling. The moment you crossed into town, something seemed different. The streets felt quieter. The air felt heavier. The town wasn't frightening exactly, but it carried a strange weight that was difficult to describe. Even as a child, I noticed it. The kind of feeling that settles somewhere in your chest without any obvious reason. Despite that, I loved visiting my Nana. The house was full of family history, old furniture, photographs, and stories. Every room seemed connected to someone who had lived there decades earlier. Naturally, a house that old had seen its share of deaths over the years. Nothing dramatic or violent. No murders. No dark family secrets. Just the normal passage of time. Elderly relatives passing away after long lives. Children lost to illnesses during eras when medicine wasn't what it is today. The kinds of tragedies that become part of a family's history when enough generations pass through the same home. One particular night, I was staying over at Nana's house, as I had many times before. Nothing unusual had happened during the day. We spent time together, ate dinner, watched television, and settled into the comfortable routine that always came with visiting her. When it was time for bed, I made myself a pallet on the floor in the living room. I'd done it countless times before. There was something comforting about falling asleep in that old house while a movie played quietly in the background. That night, an old film was playing on television. I don't remember what it was. I only remember drifting off to sleep while listening to the dialogue and music. At some point during the night, I began dreaming. The dream felt incredibly vivid. I wasn't in a house anymore. I was floating. My pallet had somehow become a raft drifting through the ocean. The water stretched endlessly in every direction. The sky above was dark. Waves rolled gently beneath me. What stands out most about the dream was how real it felt. I could actually feel the water. Warm salt water splashed against my face over and over again. The sensation was so convincing that even within the dream I was aware of it. Each splash felt distinct. Warm, wet Reel the Dream continued for what felt like a long time. Then suddenly, I woke up. The first thing I saw was the clock. It was exactly 3 a.m. Even now, I remember that detail clearly. At first, I was disoriented. Part of me still felt trapped between sleep and wakefulness. I could still feel the warm liquid on my face. For a brief moment, my brain struggled to understand what was happening. Then, reality hit me. The warm liquid wasn't ocean water. It was blood. A lot of blood. I immediately sat upright. My pillow was soaked. The left side of my face was covered. My hair was sticky. Blood stained everything around me. It was easily the worst nosebleed I had ever experienced. In fact, I've only had a handful of nosebleeds throughout my entire life, which makes this one even stranger. The amount of blood was shocking. As a kid, seeing that much blood on yourself is enough to trigger immediate panic. Oddly, though, I wasn't panicking. I felt strangely calm, almost detached. The dream still lingered in my mind, making everything seem slightly unreal. At the same time, another feeling had appeared. The sensation that someone was watching me. It wasn't overwhelming. It wasn't intense. Just a quiet awareness sitting in the back of my mind, as though I wasn't alone. Under normal circumstances, that feeling would have terrified me. But I was exhausted, far too tired to think about it deeply. I got up, cleaned myself off, took care of the mess, and tried not to wake anyone. Eventually, after dealing with everything, I returned to the living room. This time, I decided to sleep on the couch instead of the floor. The house was silent. The television was off. The darkness felt heavier than before. I lay there staring into the room, trying to settle back down. That's when I heard it. A creak. It came from the kitchen. Old houses make noises constantly, so at first I didn't think much of it. Then another sound followed. I lifted my head slightly and looked toward the doorway connecting the kitchen and living room, and that's when I saw it. Standing in the doorway was what appeared to be a giant floating portrait. Not a person, not a shadow, a portrait. At least that's the only way I've ever been able to describe it. The image hung there in midair as though someone had suspended a massive painting in the doorway. The face in the portrait belonged to an elderly man, He wasn't moving. He wasn't speaking. He was simply there, floating, watching. I remember freezing immediately, every muscle in my body locked up. I couldn't look away. The image was incredibly clear. This wasn't a vague shape hiding in darkness. I could see details. The face, the expression, the frame, everything. Yet strangely enough, I wasn't terrified. Looking back, that may be the weirdest part of the entire experience. The sight should have frightened me. Instead, I mostly felt stunned. Confused, mesmerized, I stared at it for what felt like an eternity. Maybe it was only a few seconds. Maybe it was several minutes. I honestly don't know. Eventually, exhaustion won. The last thing I remember is continuing to stare at the portrait before drifting back to sleep. When morning arrived, my feelings had changed completely. The calmness was gone. The moment I fully woke up and remembered everything, a wave of unease hit me. I suddenly wanted out of that house. Immediately, the feeling was difficult to explain. Nothing threatening had happened. The portrait hadn't moved. It hadn't spoken. Yet I couldn't shake the sense that something was deeply unsettling about the entire experience. I spent the rest of the morning feeling nervous and uncomfortable. Eventually, I left and tried not to think about it too much. Life moved on. Years passed. The experience became one of those strange memories that occasionally resurfaced but never fully made sense. Then, something happened that brought it all rushing back. A few years later, I was helping my Nana clean out her basement. Up until that point, I had never really spent time down there. The basement was filled with old family belongings accumulated over generations. Boxes, furniture, photographs, the usual collection of items that gather in old houses. As we sorted through everything, I noticed something leaning against a wall. The moment I saw it, my stomach dropped. It was the portrait. The exact same portrait. The same elderly man. The same face. The same image I had seen floating in the doorway years earlier. I remember standing there, staring at it in disbelief. Every detail matched my memory. I didn't need anyone to tell me it was the same one. I knew immediately. When I asked about it, I learned something even stranger. The man in the painting was my great-great-great-grandfather, the very man who had built the house. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. I had never seen the portrait before that night, at least not consciously. I had never been in the basement where it was stored. Nobody had ever shown it to me. Yet somehow, I had seen it, or at least that's how it felt. Maybe there was a rational explanation. Maybe I had caught a glimpse of it years earlier and forgotten. Maybe my brain stored the image somewhere deep in my memory and reproduced it during a strange half-asleep state. That's certainly possible. In fact, it's probably the explanation most people would choose. The problem is that it still doesn't fully explain how vividly I remembered it. Nor does it explain why the experience felt so real. I've spent many nights in that house, both before and after the incident. Most of them were completely uneventful. There were a few other strange experiences over the years. Small things, odd moments that never made complete sense. But nothing ever affected me quite the way that night did. Even now, when I think about my Nana's house, that's the memory that immediately comes to mind. The dream of floating on the ocean. The sensation of warm liquid against my face. Waking up at exactly 3 a.m., covered in blood from an unexplained nosebleed. The feeling of being watched. And finally, the sight of an old portrait floating silently in a doorway. Maybe it was all coincidence. Maybe it was exhaustion, dreams, and childhood imagination combining into a single, unforgettable experience. Or maybe there was something about that old house that I'll never fully understand. Whatever the truth is, the memory has stayed with me for years. And every time I picture that portrait, I can still see the face of the man who built the house staring back at me from the darkness, exactly as clearly as I saw him that night. I have more than a few I could share, but one I've never talked about was when my friend's younger brother creeped me out. As a preface, I do not believe in the paranormal. This would have been about 12 or so years ago, so I was in my early 20s/late teens, and one of my friends, who was also my weed deal, has a brother who was about a decade or so younger than us. I'd say he was somewhere between 8 and 10. He was always a very different kid. Possibly on the spectrum? I'm far from an expert in that area. He was just very odd. But one night we were in his garage having a smoke session. It was the dealer friend, another friend, and me. As we were getting ready to leave, his younger brother had come out, and I don't remember exactly what he said. But as he was saying bye to us, he also said goodbye to the tall, skinny man. At the time, I didn't think much of it, but my friend I drove over there with is kind of a scaredy cat and very much believes in the paranormal, and we were both stoned. So on the drive home, he looks white as a ghost and brought it up. I was just sort of like, dude, WTF, chill law. So a few nights later, I was inside with the little brother alone because my dealer friend had gone somewhere that I can't remember, and he was coloring or something. And I asked him, hey, do you remember the other night when we were here? And he looked at me all confused and said, yeah. And I asked if he remembered saying goodbye to a tall, skinny man, to which he said, yeah. Why? And I asked who that was, and if he meant the friend I was with. And he said, no. The tall, skinny man that's always with you. I felt the hairs on my neck stand up as I furrowed my brow, and I asked Sammy, is the tall, skinny man here with me now? And he said, yeah, he's back there. And he lifted his little pointer finger and pointed behind me at the dark, empty corner on the opposite side of the room. Again, I do not believe in the paranormal, and kids are dumb. But I can still remember staring into that dark, empty corner for what felt like eons until the sound of my friend opening the garage door broke the silence. There are moments in life that seem almost unreal when you look back on them. The kind of stories that sound made up, even though every part of them actually happened. This is one of those stories for me. It took place roughly 25 years ago when I was much younger. Back then, my friends and I spent a lot of time wandering around late at night. We lived in an area where there wasn't much to do, and it wasn't unusual for us to go for long walks after dark just to hang out, talk, and get away from home for a while. On this particular night, a friend and I had decided to go for a walk and smoke a joint. Nothing unusual, nothing memorable. At least that's what we thought at the time. It was late, well after dark, and the streets were mostly empty. The neighborhood was quiet, in that way only late-night neighborhoods can be. The world felt slower. There were no crowds, no traffic, and very few people around. We were walking alongside a large park. The park itself was surrounded by a fence that stretched along most of the property. During the daytime, it was a normal place where families gathered, kids played sports, and people walked their dogs. At night, it felt completely different. The trees became dark silhouettes. The pathways disappeared into shadow. Everything seemed larger and emptier. My friend and I were talking and laughing as we walked, completely focused on our own conversation. Then we noticed someone ahead of us. A man suddenly appeared by jumping over the park fence. The strange thing was how normal it looked. There was nothing dramatic about it. He didn't seem to be running. He didn't appear nervous. He simply hopped over the fence as casually as someone stepping over a puddle. At first, I assumed he was taking a shortcut through the park. People did that all the time. Nothing about his behavior immediately raised any alarms. As he approached us, he called out and asked if we had a light. Again, completely normal. Back then, it wasn't unusual for strangers to ask for a lighter or a cigarette. My friend happened to have one, so we stopped for a moment. The man walked over. I remember him looking fairly ordinary, not particularly threatening, not particularly memorable. If you had asked me to describe him before the events of the next day, I probably couldn't have told you much beyond basic details. He thanked us for the lighter and began lighting a cigarette. Everything felt casual, completely routine. Just three people sharing a brief interaction on a quiet night. Then he said something. At the time, it sounded bizarre, but not bizarre enough. Not to us, not in the state we were in. As he lit his cigarette and took the first drag, he casually said something along the lines of, "The first smoke after killing a girl really hits you right." Then he smiled, or maybe laughed. Honestly, I can't remember exactly. What I do remember is how we reacted. We laughed, not because we thought murder was funny, because we assumed it was a joke, a weird joke, a dark joke, but a joke. Looking back now, I realize how strange that sounds. But context matters. We were young, we were high, and people say ridiculous things all the time, especially late at night, especially to strangers. At the time, the comment felt so absurd that neither of us took it seriously for even a second. In our minds, there was no possibility he was telling the truth. People don't casually confess to murder while borrowing a lighter from strangers. At least, that's what we thought. So, we laughed awkwardly. He laughed. The interaction ended. Then, we continued walking. Within a few minutes, we had already moved on to another topic. The encounter became just another strange moment during a random late-night adventure. By the time I got home, I had almost forgotten about it. The next morning changed everything. I woke up and went about my normal routine. At some point, either the television was on or someone mentioned a news report. However it happened, I became aware that police had arrested a local man. The story immediately caught my attention. According to the report, the man had been arrested for murdering his girlfriend. As more details emerged, my stomach started dropping. The location sounded familiar. The timeline sounded familiar. And then came the realization. The man being discussed on the news was the same man we had encountered the previous night. The same man who jumped over the fence. The same man who borrowed our lighter. The same man who casually joked about killing a girl. I remember feeling physically sick. At first, I tried convincing myself it couldn't be the same person. Surely it was a coincidence. Surely my brain was connecting unrelated events. But the more information that became available, the more obvious it became. It was him. The realization hit like a truck. Suddenly the conversation replayed in my head. Every detail felt different. The casual attitude, the strange comment, the way he had said it, the fact that he had apparently come directly from the direction of the park. Everything that seemed harmless the night before now felt horrifying. What disturbed me most was how normal he had appeared. When people imagine murderers, they often picture someone visibly dangerous, someone obviously unstable, someone who looks evil. Real life doesn't work that way. The man we met seemed completely ordinary. If he hadn't made that bizarre comment, I probably wouldn't remember his face at all. That's the part that stayed with me. The contrast, the disconnect between who he appeared to be and what he had actually done. For a long time afterward, I kept replaying the encounter, wondering whether there was anything we should have noticed, anything that might have seemed suspicious, anything that should have made us realize he wasn't joking. But honestly, I don't think there was. The comment itself was so outrageous that our brains automatically categorized it as humor. Dark humor, sure, but humor. The possibility that he was speaking literally never even crossed our minds. And why would it? Most people aren't prepared for a real confession. Most people assume strangers aren't casually admitting to murder on a sidewalk. Yet that's apparently exactly what happened. The whole experience changed the way I looked at random encounters. Before that night, strangers were just strangers. Afterward, I became much more aware of how little we actually know about the people around us. You can stand next to someone, talk to them, share a brief conversation, and have absolutely no idea what they've done. The experience also changed my relationship with late-night walks. Before then, my friend and I loved wandering around after dark. There was something peaceful about empty streets and quiet neighborhoods. After that encounter, the feeling changed. The world seemed less innocent, less predictable. We became more cautious. In fact, we largely stopped doing those late-night strolls altogether, partly because of safety concerns, partly because neither of us could shake the memory. Even now, 25 years later, I still think about that night occasionally. I think about how close we came to crossing paths with someone who had apparently just committed a horrific crime. I think about how casually the interaction unfolded, and I think about that sentence. At the time, it sounded like a terrible joke. The next day, it turned into something far more disturbing. The strangest part is that if the news story had never appeared, I would probably remember the encounter completely differently. I would tell it as a story about a weird guy making a dark joke in the middle of the night. Nothing more. Instead, it became one of the most unsettling memories of my life. Because every now and then, I remember standing on that sidewalk, handing a lighter to a stranger, laughing at what I thought was an absurd joke, completely unaware that he wasn't joking at all. And that realization is still enough to send a chill down my spine. One of the strangest experiences of my life happened in a house that should have felt familiar. It was my grandparents' house. I had spent years there growing up. Family gatherings, holidays, random weekends, summer afternoons, some of my earliest memories were connected to that place. It wasn't some abandoned mansion in the middle of nowhere, or an old house with a reputation for being haunted. It was simply my grandparents' home. At least, that's what it had been. By the time this happened, my grandparents had already moved out. The house was empty and listed for sale. Most of the furniture was gone, and the property was sitting there, waiting for its next owners. For whatever reason, a group of my friends and I decided it would be a good idea to sneak over there and use the swimming pool. Looking back, it was exactly the kind of thing teenagers do. The house was empty. Nobody was supposed to be there. And because of that, it felt exciting. There were several of us all together. I honestly don't remember the exact number anymore. What I do remember is that we arrived after dark and made our way into the backyard. At first, everything seemed completely normal. We were laughing, talking, and enjoying ourselves. The pool looked exactly the way I remembered it. The house stood quietly behind us. Nothing felt strange. Nothing felt threatening. If someone had told me at that moment that I'd still be thinking about that night years later, I would have laughed. For a while, we simply swam and hung out. Then something changed. I was in the pool with two other friends when all three of us noticed movement near the house. At first, I thought I was imagining it. The property was dark, and shadows can play tricks on your eyes at night. But then I saw it again. A blue light. Not bright like a spotlight, not flashing like a police light, just an unusual blue glow coming from inside the house. The moment I noticed it, my attention locked onto the windows. And then I saw what looked like a person moving inside. I remember freezing. The figure wasn't standing still. It appeared to be walking through the house. For a few seconds, I couldn't process what I was seeing. The house was supposed to be empty. No one lived there anymore. There shouldn't have been anybody inside. Before I could even say anything, one of my friends spoke up. "Did you see that?" The second friend immediately answered. Yeah, that was the moment my stomach dropped. If only I had seen it, I would have dismissed it. I would have blamed shadows, reflections, an overactive imagination. Anything, but 3 different people noticed it independently. 3 different people saw the blue light. 3 different people saw movement inside the supposedly empty house. The reaction was immediate. Nobody wanted to investigate. Nobody wanted to be brave. Nobody wanted to check whether it was a burglar, a realtor, or something else entirely. We were done. The fun disappeared instantly. Within moments, everyone was climbing out of the pool and getting ready to leave. I remember looking back at the house one last time. The blue glow was gone. The movement was gone. Everything looked normal again. But none of us felt normal. We left as quickly as possible. The entire drive home was filled with nervous conversations. Everyone kept repeating the same thing. They had seen it. They knew they had. Yet none of us could explain what it was. Over time, the story became harder to tell. Whenever we brought it up, people immediately offered explanations. Someone must have been inside. A neighbor's light could have reflected through a window. Maybe there was a maintenance worker checking the property. Maybe we were just scaring ourselves. Those explanations are reasonable. The problem is that the people who weren't there always seemed more certain than the people who actually witnessed it. No matter how many times we described what happened, nobody seemed to believe us. Eventually, I stopped trying to convince people. The strange thing is that the sighting itself wasn't the part that stayed with me most. It was what happened afterward. Sometime later, I returned to the property. By then, the fear from that night had mostly faded. At least, I thought it had. The moment we pulled into the driveway, something felt wrong. Not strange, not creepy. Wrong, it's difficult to explain to someone who has never experienced it. The best description I can give is that the entire property felt heavy, as though the atmosphere itself had changed. The house looked exactly the same. The yard looked exactly the same. Nothing appeared different. Yet every instinct in my body was screaming at me to leave. I remember sitting in the car, staring at the house. My chest felt tight. My hands felt cold. The longer I looked at it, the worse the feeling became. Then, something happened that completely caught me off guard. I started crying. Not because I was sad, not because anything had happened. The emotion simply overwhelmed me. At the same time, chills ran across my entire body. The feeling was so intense that I couldn't force myself to get out of the vehicle. I sat there, frozen. Every part of me wanted distance from that house. Eventually, I told whoever I was with that I wanted to leave. I couldn't do it. I couldn't go inside. I couldn't even walk onto the property. The feeling was that strong. What makes the entire experience even stranger is something that started long before that night at the pool. For years, I had recurring dreams about the house. The dreams always followed the same pattern. Something evil lived there. Not a person, not an animal, a presence. In the dreams, it would chase me through the rooms, around corners, up staircases, through hallways. No matter where I ran, it always seemed close behind. I would wake up, terrified. Then, months later, the dream would return again. The strange part is that those dreams existed before the night with the blue light, before the sighting, before the feeling that overwhelmed me when I returned. That's one of the reasons the memory has stayed with me. The timeline doesn't fit neatly into any explanation. Maybe the dreams influenced my perception later. Maybe my subconscious connected unrelated experiences. Maybe that's exactly what happened. I honestly don't know. What I do know is that the dreams felt incredibly real, and every time they happened, the house was the same. The same hallways, the same rooms, the same overwhelming feeling of being hunted by something I couldn't see. Years have passed since then. I've tried to approach the experience rationally. I've considered every explanation I can think of. Maybe there was someone inside the house that night. Maybe the blue light had an ordinary source. Maybe the emotional reaction I experienced later came from anxiety or memories attached to the property. All of those explanations are possible. In fact, they are probably more likely than anything supernatural. But even after accepting that possibility, the memory still bothers me. Not because I think I encountered a ghost. Not because I believe there was definitely something paranormal in the house. Because I can't fully explain why 3 people saw the same thing. I can't explain the overwhelming feeling I experienced later. And I can't explain why a house that had always been familiar suddenly felt so completely foreign. Whenever I tell the story, people usually don't believe it. I'm used to that. Honestly, if I heard the story from someone else, I'd probably be skeptical too. But belief doesn't really matter. Because whether anyone else believes it or not, I remember that night perfectly. I remember the blue light. I remember the figure moving through the empty house. I remember all 3 of us staring in silence. And I remember sitting in a car sometime later, unable to stop crying because every instinct I had was telling me that something inside that house was deeply, deeply wrong. Maybe there was a logical explanation. Maybe there always was. But after all these years, it's still one of the few experiences in my life that I can't fully explain. And that's exactly why I still think about it. I still remember that day as clearly as if it happened yesterday. It started like any other normal afternoon. I was at home, relaxing and trying to enjoy a quiet day. The neighborhood was usually peaceful, and nothing ever seemed to happen that would make people stop what they were doing and pay attention. Then, I heard the sound of breaking glass. At first, I thought maybe someone had accidentally dropped something. But a second later, I heard another crash, louder this time. Before I could even process what was happening, I heard my next-door neighbor screaming. The sound instantly sent a chill through me. This wasn't the kind of scream that comes from being startled or surprised. It was pure panic. The kind of scream that tells you something is seriously wrong. Without thinking, I jumped up and ran outside. As I got closer to my neighbor's house, I could hear more things being smashed inside. Glass shattering, furniture crashing into walls, objects hitting the floor. The screaming continued, mixed with sounds of chaos coming from every room. I ran to the front door and pushed my way inside. The scene was unlike anything I had ever witnessed. The living room looked as though a tornado had ripped through it. Picture frames were shattered on the floor. Lamps had been knocked over. Pieces of broken glass were scattered everywhere. A coffee table had been flipped onto its side, and one of the chairs looked like it had been thrown across the room. Standing in the middle of the destruction was my neighbor's teenage son. I had seen him many times before. He was normally quiet and polite whenever we crossed paths. But the person standing in front of me that day looked completely different. His face was twisted with rage. His breathing was heavy and erratic. His eyes looked wild. It was as if he didn't even recognize where he was or who was around him. My neighbor was terrified. She was backed into a corner, crying and pleading with him to calm down. Every time she spoke, he would yell even louder and throw something else. I immediately stepped between them. I remember trying to talk to him calmly. I told him everything was okay. I told him to take a breath. I told him nobody wanted to hurt him, but he wasn't listening. It felt like my words weren't even reaching him. For a brief moment, he stared directly at me. There was something unsettling about the way he looked at me. It wasn't anger directed at me personally. It was more like he was looking through me instead of at me. Then, everything happened incredibly fast. He suddenly turned and ran toward the kitchen. At first, I thought he was trying to get away from us. Instead, he grabbed a large kitchen knife. The second I saw the blade, I knew the situation had become much more dangerous. He spun around and pointed it directly at me. His hands were shaking. His face was red. He started shouting threats. I don't remember every word he said, but I remember him saying he would kill me if I came any closer. At that moment, every instinct I had developed during my military training kicked in. There wasn't time to think. There wasn't time to weigh different options. I knew that if I allowed him to keep control of that knife, someone could get seriously hurt. Maybe his mother. Maybe me. Maybe both of us. As he moved toward me, I reacted automatically. The next few seconds felt both incredibly fast and strangely slow at the same time. I stepped forward, redirected his arm, and knocked the knife from his hand. The blade flew across the kitchen floor and slid underneath a table. Before he could recover, I grabbed him and forced him to the ground. That was when the real struggle began. Even though he was only a teenager, he fought with a level of strength that shocked me. At the time, I was serving in the military. I was in excellent physical condition and much stronger than the average person. Physical training was part of my daily life. I was used to demanding situations and had dealt with difficult people before. But this was different. The moment he hit the ground, he exploded with energy. He twisted. He kicked. He bucked his body violently. He tried to throw me off him every possible way he could. Every muscle in his body seemed to be working at maximum effort. I put everything I had into holding him down. Even then, it felt like I was barely maintaining control. His strength didn't make sense. I know that sounds strange, but it's the only way I can describe it. It felt as though he wasn't feeling fatigue at all. Most people eventually tire during a struggle. Their movements slow down. Their breathing becomes heavier. Their strength starts fading. None of that seemed to be happening. If anything, he appeared to be getting more desperate and more powerful as the seconds passed. The entire time, his mother was crying nearby. I remember hearing her voice in the background while I focused on keeping him pinned down. Someone had called the police, but every second felt like an eternity. I kept wondering where they were. I kept thinking they needed to get there faster, because I honestly didn't know how long I could keep this up. The teenager continued fighting with unbelievable intensity. At one point, he managed to nearly throw me off balance. For a brief second, I thought he was going to break free. If that happened, I wasn't sure what would come next. The knife had been knocked away, but there were still countless objects around the house that could be used as weapons. I tightened my grip and managed to regain control. Then something happened that has stayed with me for years. During the struggle, his eyes suddenly rolled back. For a moment, all I could see were the whites of his eyes. It happened so unexpectedly that it genuinely frightened me. I had never seen anything like it before. The image is still burned into my memory. His body continued fighting and thrashing while his eyes appeared completely rolled back. It was one of the most unsettling things I have ever witnessed. I remember wondering if he was having some kind of medical episode. I wondered if he was under the influence of something. I wondered if there was a psychological crisis happening. At the time, I had no idea. All I knew was that I had to keep him from hurting himself or anyone else. The struggle continued. His breathing became louder. His movements became more frantic. Then I noticed blood. A thin stream was running from his nose. At first, I thought he might have injured himself during the chaos inside the house. There had been so much broken furniture and shattered glass that it was impossible to know exactly what had happened before I arrived. The blood slowly dripped downward while he continued fighting against me. It was an alarming sight. His mother became even more distressed when she saw it. I tried reassuring her that help was on the way, but honestly, I was just trying to stay focused myself. The entire situation felt surreal. The destruction around us, the screaming, the blood, the impossible strength, the strange look in his eyes. None of it felt real. It felt like something from a movie rather than something happening in a quiet neighborhood where everyone knew each other. Finally, after what felt like forever, I heard sirens approaching. It was one of the most relieving sounds I have ever heard. A few moments later, police officers rushed into the house. They quickly assessed the situation and moved in to help. Once they had control of him, I slowly let go and backed away. Only then did I realize how exhausted I was. My arms felt like they were made of concrete. My shoulders were burning. My heart was pounding. The adrenaline that had been carrying me through the entire ordeal was beginning to wear off. I sat down for a moment and tried to catch my breath. The officers continued handling the situation while medical personnel were called to evaluate the teenager. His mother was shaken, but safe. That was the most important thing. As everything finally calmed down, I looked around the house again. The damage was extensive. Broken glass covered the floors. Furniture was destroyed. Walls had been damaged. It looked completely different from the home I had entered only minutes earlier. Even after all these years, that day remains one of the strangest experiences of my life. I've seen difficult situations before and after that incident, but very few have stayed with me the way this one has. What I remember most isn't the destruction or even the knife. It's the teenager himself, the overwhelming strength he displayed, the way he fought without seeming to tire. The moment his eyes rolled back until only the whites were visible, the stream of blood running from his nose while he continued struggling. Those images never left me. To this day, I still don't know exactly what was happening with him in that moment. Maybe there was a medical explanation. Maybe there was a psychological explanation. Maybe there were circumstances I never learned about afterward. What I do know is that it was one of the most intense and unsettling encounters I have ever experienced. Years have passed since then, but every now and then I'll hear a loud crash somewhere or think back to that neighborhood, and the memory comes rushing back. The broken glass, the terrified screams, the knife, the fight, and those strange white eyes staring into nothing, while I struggled with every ounce of strength I had to keep him pinned to the floor until help finally arrived.